Hello, everybody. Welcome to another week, another edition of Daily Kos's The Brief, our weekly show about politics. I'm Marcos Molitzis. I'm here with Carrie Eleveld, and we are going to be talking today about immigration. It is an incredibly complex, difficult subject. It is possibly one of the only things Republicans can run on the last three cycles. I mean, they've obsessed about this topic. And right now, as we're finding, Carrie's been writing about this repeatedly over this last week. You should check out her writings at Daily Kos. But the Republican Party is bankrupt. They are in disarray. They have no clue about what to do. They had this sort of Donald Trump problem. He brought people out, but he didn't bring them out on conservative ideas or conservative principles or conservative anything. He brought them out on bigotry, and he brought them out on these almost irrelevant cultural war issues that resonate very strongly with this disaffected corner of America, but really isn't enough to win a national election, and it is bleeding them support, particularly given that the core of the Republican base is older, white, rural males, and they are literally dying off. And the younger generations are incredibly liberal. They're making me look as though I'm stodgy, old conservative, old dude, right? And so culture's evolving, the nation's evolving, the Republican Party is not. So Carrie, you've been really on this beat. You're like drilling it, right? And I've been enjoying your writings on the subject, and particularly digging into just how unpopular the Republican Party is, even with Republicans. Isn't that so?
Yeah. I mean, so, yesterday I started digging into the numbers that we have available to us through Civics, the Civics dashboard, the polling firm that, is sort of our sister company. And it's amazing what the wealth that you can find on there just on the public stuff, right? There's other stuff too. But anyway, so, I was looking at
civics.com, civicswithaQ.com.
CivicswithaQ.com. So I was looking at it and I was like, whoa, like the Democratic Party is, popular among 88% of Democratic voters, which is a number that you would pretty much expect, right? Pretty close. Yes, it's pretty standard. But I was looking at the GOP numbers, and among Republican voters, the Republican Party is only has a favorable rating from 65% of Republican voters, and it has a 19% unfavorable rating. And I just thought, man, this is just a snapshot of what, emblematic of what is plaguing the GOP right now, is that they don't have a leader. They don't have policies, right? They don't have agreed upon policies anymore, other than like culture war stuff. But they don't have
Dr. Seuss.
Dr. Seuss.
Boy, they get excited about Dr. Seuss, but
immigration and not letting youth, trans athletes participate in sports, this ridiculous stuff that, unfortunately is going to be really ugly in 2022. It's not ridiculous in terms of the way they're going to prosecute it, but the idea that, this is what they're going after, but they just don't know they have no leader who can really lead the party anymore. Donald Trump really hasn't shown interest in leading the party.
No,
they don't have these. Right. He attacks it, and he's attacking McConnell. He's attacking, the House, the Congress people GOP Congress people who voted to impeach him. And, he's actually clearly more interested in those grievances than he is in making sure that the Republicans retake and regain control of Congress in 2022.
Yeah, he literally crashed a wedding at his hotel to air his grievances. He literally crashed a wedding. But think 19%, that's 1 in 5 Republicans do not like the Republican Party. And yeah, there are Democrats who don't like the Democrats, but it's a tiny, a lot of them would be like the Bernie, supporters. A lot of them don't even call themselves Democrats, so they're out of that pool. But you're always going to have people that aren't particularly happy about the direction their party is going. There's only 2 parties, right? You have countries with dozens of parties. We have 2 parties. You can't cram everybody's ideology into 2 parties. That said, 19%, 1 in 5 is historically high. And when you talk about the lack of policy, where it really came through just recently on a practical level was the battle over the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan, right?
Right.
All of them voted against it. So at least they got that part right. But they never mounted a cohesive opposition to it because they don't have an ideology to oppose it with. Donald Trump wanted payments to people. Donald Trump wanted a push for loans to businesses. Everything that was in that bill was things that Trump had talked about or had supported. So they really had lost the ability to make a policy argument against it. So they were left to, flailing about socialism, which had zero traction. And it's amazing, and you've written about this, Carrie, how popular the American Rescue Plan has been, even amongst Republicans.
Right. So Pew they had a sample pool of like 12,000 voters that they did some polling with. So it's a huge sample, right? And they found that among Republican voters, when you split them into lower income, middle income, and upper income, right? The lower income Republicans supported that rescue plan at around 63% support. So that's nearly 2/3 of lower income Republicans saying, sign me up for this, I'm on board, right? And Republicans didn't even know what to do with that. I mean, you saw Mitch McConnell trying to sort of like, say, the economy was just starting to fire on all burners before this rescue plan. So he's trying to like rob credit from Biden and the Democrats while also not voting for it at all, not voting for the plan at all. And I think, one of the things that was most, that really showed us that they made, that they had completely blown their opposition arguments, right? Which there were none. There was no cohesive argument, is that the bill got more popular as it went along. And that is just really very unusual for a big, epic, legislative
generational. Yeah, like it's a generational piece of legislation.
Right, that it just kind of sailed through. I mean, all of the, back and forth was among Democrats. What are we going to keep in? It ultimately ended up, I mean, there were some things that we lost that progressives wanted. Minimum wage was one of them. There were some other things, but for the most part, Biden introduced a $1.9 trillion bill. He got a $1.9 trillion bill, and that bill got more and more popular along the way. And that just shows you that Republicans completely missed the boat on that, completely.
And what were they doing during this debate? They were talking about Dr. Seuss. They were talking about Mr. Potato Head, and they were railing against the flood or the wave at the border. There's this crisis, and so they've really sort of gone back to that. They feel comfortable with those cultural war issues that really don't resonate with a lot of people. Didn't really win them elections in 2018 because they really ran hard on Salvador and MS-13 gang.
On the caravans. How many times did Donald Trump say caravan and he went down to the border? I mean, basically, Republicans have been trying to win on this ever since Trump won in 2016. And the first really, really ugly campaign they tried for was the gubernatorial campaign in Virginia in 2017. And they lost that. And then they lost it in the midterms. And then they didn't, once again, it didn't prevail on running on immigration issues in 2020. And the only one who's saying that they can still win on this is Stephen Miller. But, Republicans are so desperate. Yeah, I mean, this, disgraced White House aide Stephen Miller, who's a total racist, and, came up with some of the worst policies. But none of his predictions came through about what would work electorally in 2018 and 2020.
So, Carrie, let's bring in our guest. We're going to do something a little bit different this week than what we usually do. Usually we bring in our guests sequentially. But today we decided that we really wanted to dig into the issue of immigration in a more comprehensive way. So we got two experts on immigration, people who can really hopefully explain this in a way that everybody understands the issues, the underlying issues, and what's at stake and what can be done about them. Our first guest, or not our first because they're both coming on at the same time. But first of all, we have Gabe Ortiz. He is a senior political writer at Daily Kos. He's one of our colleagues. And really one of the utmost authorities on immigration in this country. And the second is Juan Escalante. He is a DACA recipient who has been at the forefront of immigrant right movements for the past 15 years. He's a social strategist and has spearheaded several campaigns in support of pro-migrant policies. And to start it off, Juan, I'm going to start with you. Your intro talks about you being a DACA recipient. Can you explain what DACA recipient is to listeners who may not know what that is?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me on. And DACA is short for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And folks may remember this as the so-called executive action that President Barack Obama took out in 2012 to shield Dreamers, which is a subcategory of a specific group of immigrants at the time that were essentially vulnerable to deportations. And I'm happy to, go on and break this down as to how essentially the genesis of DACA happened. But the program DACA as a whole is currently protecting me from deportation. It allows me to obtain a driver's license and allows me to work on 2-year intervals as long as I pay a fee, submit certain documentation to the government, and pass a background check. And I think for the audience, what it's probably most relevant is that actually today, a federal judge had a hearing on the DACA program and its potential future. We may get a ruling on whether the program, according to his view, will stand or whether or not he'll declare unconstitutional. But only time will tell. All I can say is that Donald Trump pledged to undo this program on day one in his office, and Donald Trump came and went, and DACA is still here, and it will continue to be here. So I'm happy to join you all to talk about it.
Let me just frame for everybody that Judge Andrew Hanen, is, a really well-known anti-immigrant judge in the Fifth Circuit. So, it's quite possible that there's not going to be a good outcome there. But do you think this will go all the way up potentially to the Supreme Court, Juan?
I think so. I mean, my appreciation is that ultimately the administration, the federal government has, as of today, in federal courts, switched sides. So for the past 4 years, the government was essentially, in cahoots with Texas and saying that this program, was blasphemous and that it allowed illegals to essentially, get these kind of benefits. And Texas just sat there saying, we just don't want to give him driver's license, and that's the injury that our state is suffering. And not to drag this on, because obviously, and I'll point here to my friend and former colleague Gabe Ortiz. There's just a breadth and giant scope of the amount of lies and the amount of attacks that this program has received for its 8 years in existence. And not a single judge in this country has found or taken issue with the DACA program as much as Andrew Hanen down in the Fifth Circuit, as you mentioned, Carrie, has. And, I invite people to essentially become informed about the DACA program. And I think that, unfortunately for us, we can't essentially, we're talking about a federal judge, not Congress, but it does reframe the conversation that Congress right now has a plethora of immigration legislation before it, and it needs to take action immediately.
Gabe, you've been covering this issue day in, day out for years. And I admire your fortitude, and Juan, you for fighting it, because this is tough stuff, right? There aren't a lot of victories a lot of time. How did the DACA program survive the Trump years? And then just kind of a follow up to that is why are Republicans, and this is for both of you, I guess, why are Republicans so hell bent on punishing children? And to be clear to the listeners, this helps children who were brought here by their parents. They weren't even the quote lawbreakers, if you want to use that kind of terminology. They were here at no fault of their own, and Republicans have really gotten it in that they need to punish these former children. Obviously, they've grown up since then, but people who are here, they are Americans. This is the only country that they know. Yet, because their parents brought them in a way that's not authorized, Republicans insist on wanting to punish them. Like, what's the obsession with that? But first question is, how did it even survive the Trump years? I mean, he was hell bent on killing this.
Oh yeah, I mean, count me in among the people who was surprised that DACA survived the Trump presidency, because when he announced the rescission in September of 2017, that was really heartbreaking, because we thought that was it. That was really it. There's no way this is going to make it through the Supreme Court if it ever gets there. And I think it made it there and is still here today because of young immigrants like Juan, these activists who kept the program alive by fighting in the streets, through the courts, through sharing their stories. I mean, this is why DACA is one of the most supported policies when you look at the public polling, because they have shared their stories and have won that support from the public. So it's their advocacy that got it to survive all the way to here to today, where not only is DACA still in place, it's fully reopened as it was before Donald Trump moved to close it in 2017. And reason why I think Donald Trump and Republicans have been so help on trying to end it is, one, I think because it is an Obama program and they don't care what the program is. If he's behind it, they want it to end. But also because that's the playbook. Being anti-immigrant is their policy. That's their stance, and they have nothing else really to stand behind other than attacking a program like this.
Yeah, when the Dreamers, who did incredible advocacy for themselves during the Obama administration, when they more or less pushed the Obama administration into creating the DACA program. And let's be clear, the Obama administration had dragged its feet for several years saying, we don't have the executive authority to do that. And then they did it. And this is such a good example of how you may as well go ahead and do the thing you want to do and let it play out in the courts, because you never know. A lot of smart lawyers in the Obama administration have said this will never survive the legal challenges, and it has so far, right? But by pushing the Obama administration into doing that, they changed the Dream activists changed the paradigm, right? They changed the norm enough that it was hard to go back to the old way, and hopefully it will continue to survive. But I just wonder, the Republicans are so hell bent on going after immigrants. I mean, you got freaking Ted Cruz down there in a bush in Texas,
with
on
rifles.
the Rio, with rifles,
like they're under invasion.
Yeah, and like they're under invasion. I mean, the guy couldn't be a bigger loser or more of a parody of himself. But what my question is, other than just railing against everything that's happening, other than railing against the quote unquote crisis and railing against migrant children who are seriously sent here under very desperate circumstances, what are the GOP policies? What are they offering as an alternative? What is their supposed plan for this? Because I'm not seeing much from them. Oh, yeah, I can, and I'm happy to Juan or Gabe, you can step in. Just tell us which one you are so that our listeners know. Sorry.
I know that for the podcast audience, I promised, in the private chat not to make any visual cues. Just like, look at that shirt. So funny since you guys cannot see us through the Facebook Live, but Carrie, it's funny because to me, Ted Cruz was nothing short than at a mall inside, the Rainforest Cafe trying to play like explorer out there, Love talk about someone who is so disconnected from reality, right? That is not just willing to do this stunt, because that's essentially what it is. It's a political stunt designed to continue to spread fear and try to, dehumanize people's fear, people's fleeing fear and trying to seek help and escaping from dangerous conditions. And instead of actually trying to figure out a way forward in trying to come to the table and say, my name is Ted Cruz. I'm coming from a border state, and I've seen firsthand, even though it's a political stunt, but I've seen firsthand the suffering of these people. I want to be, a leader or a moral leader in this discussion. It's just They rather just try to essentially poke fun at it and continue to feed the beast that is the far right. And to be honest, I don't think that even if he came up with a solution, and if I'm not even just talking about, either senator from Texas, I'm talking about the Republican Party as a whole. Even if they came up with a solution right now, it's not a solution that is grounded on reality. It's a solution that's grounded on their terms, and that would more than anything be grounded on essentially the rhetoric of Stephen Miller and Donald Trump to try to shift the conversation that way. And for the listeners out there, I'm originally from Florida. I was born and raised in Caracas, Venezuela. I moved to Florida, lived there for 18 of the 20 years I've been in this country. And I gotta tell you, even the senators from Florida are playing into this so far much that there's a freshman representative out in the Florida Congressional District 27, Maria Elvira Salazar, former journalist for a major newscast company in Univision and Telemundo, and she knows how to sell this program. She put forth a plan called Dignity, this so-called Dignity plan, which is essentially nothing short of a wish list that is conjured up by Stephen Miller, who basically gave her a nod and a wink after meeting with her. And it's all essentially border restriction. And then as she sold it, and she spoke about this on a cable Spanish language TV interview, is that, well, we're not talking about legalizing anybody. Maybe if they wanted, after like 13 plus years of having a temporary status in this country, I guess we can talk about it then, but nobody would receive, any sort of like immigration benefits or anything like that, despite how long they lived in this country. And we're talking about millions of people like myself, like my parents, who are essentially, our friends, our neighbors, taxpayers, you name it, What the studies and the polls show are two things: immigration is good for this country, and an overwhelming majority of American voters on both sides of the aisle support Congress right now taking bold steps on immigration.
So where's the dignity part of the Dignity Act? So none, not even pretending. Yeah. There's not even a pretense of that.
Speaking of Ted Cruz, I was thinking of some of the many times he didn't show up at the border, in the previous 4 years. And when in the middle of the family separation crisis, I had totally forgotten that Democrats had proposed a bill to stop these separations. Ted Cruz supported Donald Trump on that at the very, very beginning, and backtracked from that only because the public backlash to it got so intense to it that he had to sort of change his position. Ted Cruz's response to that was to introduce a bill that would keep families jailed together. I mean, this was his humane response. So even when they do try to propose something, it's something as indecent as saying, well, we're not going to separate you. We'll just keep you locked up together. I mean,
there's the dignity right there. Yeah. Keep families jailed together is the dignity from the Republican Party.
Juan, you talked about the temporary status, and I think that's a point that we shouldn't forget here. Your status right now is temporary. There's no permanent solution. And a lot of it depends on what the Supreme Court does, if you can even continue that temporary solution. But only who can make that a permanent? That's a congressional question, correct?
That's correct. And, I think there's obviously a lot of people watching every move that the current administration is making, rightfully so. I think everybody should be involved in our government at all levels and hold people in power accountable, whether Democrats or Republicans. And when it comes down to essentially what the Biden administration is doing is trying to essentially roll the DACA program into a rulemaking process, while it's, navigating the legal system, through the judiciary right now in terms of whether or not, Judge Hainan will ultimately, try to terminate the program outright, which we have seen him do in the past. I think folks who, again, may have been watching the immigration issue closely, we're talking about the same judge that basically, for all intents and purposes, killed an Obama proposal similar to DACA, but it was called DAPA with a P instead of a C. And what that program did is that would have allowed, and I want to make this clear, it will have allowed the parents of US citizen children and legal permanent residents, meaning those who had a green card, have the same type of benefits that I currently have to protect me from deportation, for having a driver's license, having a work permit. And this judge was basically the judge that outright stopped that in its tracks. So for me, it's important, like you said, Marcos, which was that Congress has the authority right now to essentially pass bills and send one to the president to make sure that he fulfills his promise of bringing as many people out of the shadows and into a normal legal citizenship bound status that he can celebrate and take another pen and cross another item out of his list. I think that there's some political will out there, but unfortunately, what we're seeing is essentially excuses from Republican members of Congress. We're seeing relics of the past, and like the filibuster stand in the way. And I think that if we're gonna go bold and we're gonna take decisive action and truly transform this country into a better and more inclusive nation for all, then we need to do this right now and not wait until, God forbids, any sort of, midterm election or any surprises that come around. We need decisive issues right now.
Right. The House just passed a good bill on that, right? And Gabe, you've been following this, haven't you? What are its chances in the Senate? What is it? Is it the same Joe Manchin, Kristen Sinema story that we have to deal with everybody, or are there other factors at play?
That's the American Dream and Promise Act that just passed this month. It's actually the second Congress in a row that this passed, because it also passed in 2019, but because of Mitch McConnell's grip on the Senate at that point, it stalled. The difference now is that we do have the Senate. Even if it's a really slim majority, we've got the Senate. But it's interesting you mentioned about support there, because Dick Durbin, who has for basically 20 years now been introducing the DREAM Act in the Senate, he said he thought he was close to getting enough Republican support to overcome a filibuster that's a very big maybe, and we know how Republicans are. They could do the Lucy football thing, and they could go. One theory that I've heard as Republicans are maybe going to go easy on the DREAM Act as a way to getting Democrats to back down from the filibuster threat. Whether DREAM
I'll
Act
take
over,
Yeah.
if
Don't
DREAM
use the
makes
filibuster to back down on filibuster reform. Okay.
Well, there's still so many other pieces of legislation,
Of course.
the legalization for the whole undocumented population and Voting Rights Act, gun reform legislation. Well, we still have
DC,
to, do some sort of reform. So if we can pass DREAM Act, with more than 60 votes, great. But we still have so much other work that's left to do too.
Pass the DREAM Act, then reform the filibuster.
I hate to. This may not be popular. It's so hard for me to imagine Senate Republicans, and joining on that bill, and then I think it would be smart. I have so many thoughts going through my head right now. Let me just say. So without going into a whole lot of detail about Donald Trump, but Donald Trump did make an inroads in South Florida, in South Texas with Latinos, with Latino voters, right? And it's I can't believe the political malpractice of Republican Party right now, not trying to build on that success in order to bring people into their tent. Instead, they got the Ted Cruz's of the world, right? But they could be actually trying to build on some of that success. Now, there's different reasons for that success and all kinds of things. But anyway, it's so hard for me to imagine that Senate Republicans are going to do what would be the politically smart thing, which is to, say, hey, we helped pass this enormously popular piece of legislation. And but I wonder if you guys think, and maybe Juan in particular, if you think that the Biden administration is pressing as forcefully as they can. I mean, they've done some good things, right? Which is they immediately sent a comprehensive immigration bill to Congress on day one that had a pathway to citizenship in it. That was just we're not going to debate this. This is just in the bill. It had money that it was going to send back to some of the Central American countries that have, that struggle in order to try and, get at some of the issues for this migration, this epic migration. And so they did some good things, but I just wonder from an advocacy standpoint, do you think the Biden administration is doing everything that it can? And are you satisfied as an advocate with where the Biden administration is right now?
Well, I'll break that into two parts, right? We have what the Biden administration as the executive has done and what is prompting Congress to do. You're right. There is essentially the American Citizenship Act of 2021, which is sitting in Congress right now. And this is a big comprehensive bill that the Biden administration promised to deliver on day one. Promise made, promise kept. It's there in Congress. Congress can take it up and figure out what it's doing. As Gabe mentioned, there's a couple of other bills. We had the Farm Workforce Modernization Act also passed in the House this week, which will grant a pathway to citizenship for millions of farm workers out there. The Dream and Promise Act, we have the DREAM Act, we have a bunch of things out there. And I think it's up to Congress to figure out a path forward and for the administration to continue to press forward on those things, which I believe they're doing privately and publicly. Now, I will say this, and this is probably the strongest break of what we just left with Donald Trump and where we are with current President Biden and Vice President Harris, which is Donald Trump went to Florida, sent Mike Pence and a slew of Republicans down there to tell the Venezuelans, my community, the Venezuelan American community, that if Joe Biden won, that socialism will unleash on this country, that, it will be Hugo Chavez, but reincarnated in Joe Biden. And guess what? We're almost through the first 100 days, and that still hasn't happened. But
it's weird.
And I think for what's particular for the audience that may not be familiar with the intricacies of this, they basically sold so much misinformation and so many lies to that community that they promised the world is if you vote for Donald Trump, all of your problems are gonna go away. We're gonna take back Venezuela and install democracy. That did not happen. In fact, under MPP, the Migration Protection Protocols or Stay in Mexico program, they denied asylum to Venezuelans who made the journey through Mexico or to Mexico and came to our border and asked for asylum. Where was Marco Rubio? Where were the Republicans in Florida asking, hey, we're gonna welcome these people? Nothing. And for 4 years, that was essentially the tune. In the first 60 days of this administration, Joe Biden took his pen and said, you know what, we're going to give TPS a well-established program that would essentially afford certain protections from deportation, a driver's license, a work permit to, hundreds of thousands of people.
Temporary protected status. Yeah, that's temporary protected status. And to Venezuelans?
Exactly. And that's being rolled out. Venezuelans right now, if you're listening to this and if you have a family member, they have until September 5th, I believe, to apply to that program. My parents, who have lived in this country for 20 years, are actually in the process of applying. And thanks to this Biden policy, they will be, for the first time in 20 years, be able to go out, get in their car, and drive safely to the pharmacy, to the market, or take a walk in the park without fearing that someone's going to look over their shoulder and ask them for the papers.
Well, one of the things that people don't seem to realize, particularly certain marginalized communities, is that Republicans will never see you as one of their own. And I think we're seeing this right now with the anti-Asian hate, right? Where Asians were considered a quote good minority, and their families aren't breaking up, and they follow the rules, and they go to school, and blah blah blah. And now we're finding out none of that mattered. They're still othered, right? And this same thing with the Jewish community. You can go on. People, they love to other. And so I guess my question, Juan, is, so the Venezuelans thought they were like in a pal with Donald Trump, and also not them, but Nicaraguans and Cubans too. I mean, it's early. It's really early. But do you think that those communities are locked in as Republican constituencies now, or are they still swingy enough, given if Democrats and Biden deliver things that is important to those communities? And it's also, I'll rope in so that South Texan border counties too, as well, if you feel comfortable commenting on that.
Yeah.
We're all so different. People don't realize we're Latinos, but Gabe, you're Mexican. Juan, you're said Venezuelan.
Yeah. So
And
I'm Salvadoran, right? We're different.
just so people understand, the South Florida constituents we're talking about, Latino constituents, it's a heavy Cuban population down there, which is much more conservative and pro-Republican in nature. And in Texas, the South Texas constituency is more, I think, Mexican American. So I just to distinguish for people that we're talking about very different populations here. But please go ahead, Juan. I don't
want Juan, you speak up, for people that you don't feel comfortable speaking of, because everybody loves us into one freaking bucket. I'm not gonna make that mistake, but maybe
you're not wrong, but I will take this opportunity to make two very specific points. Is that in terms of the othering, at the top of the program we talked about this proposal, the dignity proposal by Maria Elvira Salazar from Florida District 27th, right? And there's a quote back here to that meeting between congressional Republicans and Stephen Miller and some of the former enforcers of Donald Trump's immigration policies. And there's a quote here that's reported in Politico, and I'm looking at it in front of my computer. It's dated February 26th of 2021, where she says to Stephen Miller, quote, "I told him that the GOP needs to attract the Browns," end quote. And when you have a member of Congress who is, who identifies as Latina, right, and essentially is used that kind of language to speak to her colleagues, it's not being done as a favor. It's actually trying to again, perpetuate this narrative of furthering out the othering narrative about that community. And when it comes down to South Florida, I think that there's an argument there in terms of what happened in the 2020 elections should be a wake-up call for local outreach, donors, and everybody else who cares about our democracy. And we saw this as far as the gubernatorial race with Andrew Gillum, where Ron DeSantis became the governor of Florida. Is that the investment in the infrastructure in the state of Florida? Yeah, it costs money because it's a big state, but the investment needs to be made. You need to reach people where they are. You need to reach people in their language, and you need to make those investments, because otherwise, what you just mentioned, Carrie, is going to come true. And I'm not saying that it's going to be locked in because of policy. I'm not going to say that it's going to be locked in because of one thing or the other. I'm saying because you may do everything on a checklist, but if you don't do the outreach to those people and sell it and remind them who gave you this, who made TPS possible, who made DACA possible, the answer is clear. It wasn't the Republican Party. It was President Obama who made DACA possible. It's President Joe Biden who's defending DACA right now today in court. It's President Biden who's defending the TPS and expanding it. And those things need to be said.
So, what's interesting is that it seems like Republicans sort of will sometimes start making slight attempts. Like, remember when Reince Priebus, after the 2012 election, he authored that GOP autopsy report where he said, if Latinos, I think he used the word Hispanics, if Hispanics hear that we don't want them in this country, they will stop listening to us, meaning the Republican Party. So it seemed like they sort of recognized that something had to happen, but then they just got pulled back by that really overtly racist, anti-immigrant base that basically controls the party, and then they end up with Donald Trump as the nominee the next time around.
One more thing on that, Gabe, because what you just said just sparked something else. Is that when we're talking about what's happening today, right? The Republican Party and Marcos and Kerry, you essentially talked about what's happening at the border. Instead of going and playing explorer and going outside of your district and state, why is Maria Elvira Salazar and Carlos Jimenez, two Republicans, members of Congress from South Florida, going to the border to repeat the anti-immigrant talking points instead of working in their community and essentially standing up right now, TPS outreach clinics, helping people file their paperwork, outreaching to that community, instead of going and essentially perpetuating, the hatred that we see out there. All I can say is, and I'm happy to hand it off again, is that all we know, all that I can draw conclusions from is that all of these members of Congress who have been to the border, especially those who went in the middle of the night, have no longer excuse not to get things done. Because if you can go to the border at 3 a.m. in the morning or middle of the night, then you can go to Congress and start working on immigration solutions immediately.
So Juan, on that point though, you asked like, why are they doing it? Do we actually know why those two Latino South Florida Republicans are just feeding into that anti-immigrant? Like, they don't need to be there. Why are they doing it? Do you know? I mean,
yeah, I think it's their way, not their way, but I think it's the way that leadership, if the leader in, Kevin McCarthy is offering you a field trip to the border, number one, you probably are not going to say no. But number two, I think it's a very concerted and strategic effort to use them and say, we're a diverse crowd. Look at these Latinos that we brought here to the border with us, who can essentially, this is the next generation of the Republican Party. And I just, in good conscience, as a public servant and as an elected official, that if I were in their shoes, I would say, minority leader, I'm not going to go to that because it goes against my constituency. Also, the state of Florida is nowhere near the Texas border. And I'm sorry, I'm just not going to go there.
Yeah. Elected officials elected officials can always they always have an excuse if they don't want to show up next to somebody, right? They have a family emergency. They don't really need to go. So they're there because they want to be there. Go ahead, Carrie.
Well, let's talk for a second, because I think we would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about what's actually happening there. We've talked a lot about that Republican posturing, but a lot of the Washington media wants to paint what's happening at the border as a crisis. The White House says this is not a crisis. I think President Biden did quite a good job at his press conference last week of really humanizing this issue and talking about, look, people sitting around a table don't look at each other, if they're in some Central American country and say, hey, I got a great idea. Let's just, sell everything we own and give all our money to a coyote so that they can, take our children up to, the United States of America. And what he's essentially saying is, look, this is very obviously incredibly desperate situations that people feel like they're fleeing violence. There's no opportunity for them. They would never do this otherwise. No one would ever put their children through that if they didn't think they had an opportunity at a better life on the other side. But I think we need to understand, is there a crisis there? And if Juan or Gabe, either one of you, would put in context for us and for the listeners what is happening at the border right now with the migrant children in the surge.
Sure, I can offer a couple words. I think, speaking of these wording that you're hearing, surge, flood, I think a lot of that language is really dehumanizing, first of all, that we're seeing in the mainstream reporting. We always have to remember that these are our children. So there is an urgency there because they are children, and they're already really vulnerable when they come to our country, and even more so because they're coming without a parent. They might be coming with a sibling, perhaps an older relative, but because it's without a parent, they're already missing someone who would be an advocate for them in normal circumstances. And there's an urgency because there are many children who are stuck in these board facilities, thousands of children, many of them past the 3-day limit because of the capacity limits at HHS licensed facilities. There's general agreement that these board facilities are not fit for children. I personally think they're not really fit for adults either. But the danger is that there are many children who are stuck in these facilities because they cannot be transferred to HHS quick enough. So I think that above all,
what does transferring to HHS mean? Just so people understand.
When a child arrives to the border without a parent, the normal process is that they're supposed to be transferred from board facilities to a Health and Human Services licensed facility as soon as possible, but within 3 days. And at that point is where they would be connected with a sponsor who is usually a relative that's already here. Sometimes it's even a parent. And so the goal is that happens as soon as possible. But because of those capacity limits, we're seeing all these children who are stuck in these boat facilities.
Okay. Is it a crisis in the sense that Republicans are trying to make it out? Clearly, every individual that has made that desperate journey is in a own personal crisis. I don't think anybody can argue that. But is it a crisis in the sense that America is under assault, as Fox News would probably say?
Children are not a surge. They are not a siege. They are children. And what they're doing in asking for asylum is the law. Asylum is the law. And it was only under Donald Trump that asylum somehow became, was no longer policy.
Yeah.
What kind of numbers, Juan, what kind of numbers are we looking at here? And if I remember correctly, I think when a Biden administration official said, look, and it may have been President Biden himself, look, there's an uptick in migrant children coming to the U.S. basically every spring. So, I just wonder, how does this look in terms of past trends of similar situations?
Well, there's no denying that we have seasonal migration and that these patterns have, we're not talking about something new, I guess is what I'm trying to get at. And, I guess what Gabe and Marcos were essentially exchanging right now is that when you have an administration, and I'm talking about the Trump administration, that basically takes issue with asylum policy and does everything in its power, and I mean from firing officials to trying to halt the process, to outlining policies that keep people in tents outside of ports of entry, you will have essentially, and I think that it sometimes is confusing to me, or not confusing, but incredible to me that we forget that we were dealing with an administration that did not admit that it lost the election immediately and withheld the ability for the hiring of certain government officials to start doing their work from the moment that the election results were announced, didn't concede, and the Biden administration not only started without any sort of personnel at the Department of Homeland Security that was cleared, trained, and knowledgeable about immigration-related issues as it pertains to the border and asylum, but it also started behind. We're talking about an administration that's two months old. We're not, it takes time to get all that clearance and all that kind of stuff. Am I making excuses? I don't think so, because if you're behind and the Trump administration put these roadblocks out there to try to slow the rollout of policies that could have aided the Biden administration, then it did so successfully. And it's nothing else. It's inflating the situation that we're seeing out here. And just to kind of even bring it home even further, what Gabe mentioned is that we're talking about kids. If a child came to your door, and if you lived in an apartment complex or if you lived in a neighborhood, I don't care where you live, but if a child came knocking on your door and said, I can't find my parents, or I just fled a very dangerous situation without my parents, can you help me? Your first response should not be slamming the door in the face of the child and saying, sorry, kid, beat it. It should be like, oh my God, like, who are you? How can I help you? What's your name? And then figure out a process to essentially put that child in safe, considerate hands and figure out how to remedy from there. Because you may not have all the answers yourself, but there are systems of government that do. And as we know, everything that's being done is to essentially undermine that narrative that we're trying to be a productive and compassionate nation who understands what the problem is, what the root of the problem is, and now we're trying to find solutions as we're trying to navigate these waters.
Yeah, it would be nice if the QAnon crowd found the real children that need to be saved, right? They're not hiding in the basement of a pizzeria in Washington, D.C. So
I actually prefer they be away from those children, though.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. No, Gabe, you're absolutely right. I don't know what I'm thinking. So we're actually almost out of time. So I'd like to ask both you, Juan and Gabe, starting with you, Juan, we like to give people things to do, what actions they can take to help move things along. And so this is your chance, Juan, to pitch what you think people should be doing to make the situation better.
Yeah. it's no secret to me that a lot of the folks over the Daily Kos community are very politically savvy. Obviously, if you're watching this, you're a big fan of Daily Kos as much as I am. And I got to tell you, tomorrow we'll see President Biden go to Philly and essentially speak about his Build Back Better program. Is he going to talk about immigration? I have no idea. But what I would say to the people watching is that you can literally do what we have known to be true for the past decade and further. Call your member of Congress, specifically your senator, and say, I need to see legislation that builds a pathway to legalization for the dreamers, the TPS holders, the essential workers, the immigrants who make this country work in the second recovery package. Because we know that even if Senator Durbin is confident that there may be 60 votes in there are only 60 votes until those buttons are pressed and we have 60 votes on the record. Because the other thing that could happen, and I know that we started, this program talking about Marco Rubio, and I just want to bring it back around. Marco Rubio told the mothers of dreamers, don't worry about me. I'm going to vote for immigration legislation. Worry about my colleagues, and I'll make sure that I vote right there. We have that on videos on YouTube, nothing that I'm making up. And what did he do? He turned around, voted against his own bill back in 2013. So I just want to make sure. Exactly.
His
own immigration bill.
Against his own bill and against what his mother told him to do.
Yeah. So I know that Gabe, has also written extensively about this. But for me, the clear thing right now is that we have an opportunity to attach legislation to an incredibly important piece of legislation that is going to bring relief to millions of Americans who need it as we rebuild and emerge from the COVID-19 crisis. But it should not exclude by any means the frontline workers who are undocumented, the dreamers who have put their health risk and risk their lives to work in the hospitals or in essential jobs, TPS holders, farm workers who have continued to pick crops day and night, sometimes without PPE whatsoever, and those people need to be included. So if you are calling members of Congress about the second package to build back better this country, I implore you, I am asking you right now to make sure that you ask your senator to make sure that they include bills and legislation that build a pathway to citizenship for millions of immigrants in that bill as well.
Gabe, your turn.
I would piggyback on what Juan just said. It's so important that we take on and do an overhaul and reform our immigration system so that we can, first of all, protect the asylum system that's been decimated over the last couple of years and create more legal pathways for families so they don't have to take these dangerous journeys and risk their lives and drown in the Rio Grande as a child did just a couple days ago. I think we also really have to pressure our legislators and President Biden to move away from this policy of throwing billions at agencies like ICE and CBP and the wall, and instead use that money to create a better, more humane system where we treat children with dignity and humanity and the way we would want our own loved ones to be treated.
Juan Escalante, Gabe Ortiz, we're really privileged and honored to have taken so much of your time today to discuss these issues. I thought this show was absolutely fantastic. So thank you so much for joining us.
It's always a pleasure. Happy to be here.
Thanks. Carrie, do you have any big takeaways?
Well, I've always got something to say. It's a question of whether it's worthwhile or not. No, I mean, just for anybody who's in their head thinking, well, Juan's talking about adding something into an infrastructure bill that isn't infrastructure. That is absolutely infrastructure. It's what people in many different, facets call human infrastructure, investing in human infrastructure. And, these farm workers, along with many other people who've put their lives on the line, the frontline workers and whatever, they have provided our food for the last year, where literally, many of us, yeah. I mean, I was privileged enough to stay home most of the time, and and we wouldn't have eaten without them. So, yeah. This is vital human infrastructure and deserves to be in that bill. And there's only so many bills that we're going to get through this Congress, given where we are. So that's one thing. The other thing that just amazes me is just how much of a backlog of things, need to be done on immigration. And that is the fault entirely of the Republican Party. The Senate passed a bipartisan bill in, was it 2012 or 2013?
Yeah,
and John Boehner, who was Speaker of the House at that point, Republican Speaker, refused to put it on the floor for a vote, and it had the votes to pass. It's just that a majority of his caucus didn't want him to do it. And if they had done that, Republicans could have claimed partial victory there and said, hey, we're just, they could have been, right. They could have been playing, making a play for immigrant
the Republican
votes
House passed. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And they didn't. And the votes were there. That's what's so frustrating about it. And I actually saw John Boehner say, one of the things I regret most, I can't remember if he said this directly or if someone, but it's not putting that bill on the floor. Well, sorry, buddy. Like, you had your freaking chance and you totally blew it. And instead, you know what you're remembered for? Nothing. They got nothing done, nothing under his leadership. And then he retired because, he couldn't control that caucus. Anyway, I'm still furious over it.
No, it's a good reason to be furious. I'm always furious at it's never Democrats who go like, I regret having done, not pushed for something great, right? It's always Republicans like Lee Atwater, like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have run those racist campaigns. Well, too late.
Yeah.
Go to the grave with that on your conscience. You know what struck out to me the most was when Juan was talking about how do you see children in desperate need knocking on the door, and your response is to slam the door on their face. And it sort of reminds me of this viral video of the Asian woman being assaulted in New York City, and the doorman just, at this hotel or I don't know building closes the door. Like, you do not close the door on people in need. And for Republicans to talk about abortion and saving children and the babies, but then be so viciously anti-helping people, children after they're born. In so many different examples, right? From assistance to single mothers to this. Really shows just how cruel they are and how abortion really has never been an issue, not to switch gears or anything, but it's never been about children. It's been about controlling women's sexuality, right? Because if it came to helping kids, if they said, have those children, but we're gonna make sure they're taken care of because children are precious, then I might disagree still, but I could at least see some logic to it. But there's no, it's never been about kids with them. And that to me is what's painful, is that this Republican desire to punish children, to punish now adults who came as children, who know no other country than this one, and have endured, challenges that some of these Republicans couldn't stand to bear. They can't even wear a mask, Carrie. How could they actually handle 1,000-mile journey with a coyote through inhospitable terrain and all manners of atrocities, and then crossing the river, and then getting through law enforcement, and then being in a country where you don't speak the language, where you don't know the culture, trying to make your life? They wouldn't last 20 seconds.
This is one place where I thought President Biden in his press conference. I mean, President Biden, of course, held his first press conference with the media last week. It was much anticipated, and then everybody was like, "Oh, he paused one time, and it was horrible." So, I wrote a piece, and it was titled, Joe Biden wiped the floor with Republicans during his first press conference. And I really think he did. I really think he wiped floor with them. And I'm happy to say when I think we're sucking wind. And I think he really put the screws to him. But one of the things he did so well was humanize this situation. I talked about it earlier. And one thing he said about the migrant children is, what you're talking about is supposedly these migrant children get here. They're on the other side of the border. They're hungry. They have no way back. And you want me to turn my back on them, to close the doors. I'm paraphrasing here. He said, that is something I will never do. I will never do. And I say, amen. We're never doing that. We should never do that to any kid who shows up at the border and is in a desperate situation, oftentimes without their parents. We should never, ever, ever do that. We have the resources to take care of those kids and to figure out how they can live a better life.
Carrie, amen. That's all the time we have today. That was kind of an amazing episode. I'm a little, a little emotionally.
I know, me too. I'm
it.
sorry. I got these eyes, and you can just see them well up. I'm kind of a crier. I'm kind of a crier. So anyway.
So thank you so much for listening. Thanks to our guest, Gabe Ortiz of Daily Kos, and Juan Escalante, who's a dreamer. He's at forward.us, fwd.us. Thanks to our producer, Walter Einenkelt. Thanks to you, our listeners, for tuning in and listening. If you're enjoying the show, be sure to subscribe and give us a rating wherever you get your podcasts. You can always talk to us at dailykos.com or on Twitter at dailykos. Thank you so much for joining us. See you next week.